city for me was one of my best schools, bar none, in terms of cultural humility. I can go from my starting point, cultural reference being a Hispanic, to my best friend at the time who was Punjabi, Indian. Then from there go to another good friend who's Japanese, and so I had to learn. Some houses you take your shoes off, other places get ready for the aroma of all the spices in their cupboard, or another place where you just had to learn to be culturally sensitive. And in a city like San Francisco, you can run into 5 or 6 different cultures in one single day's journey.
Welcome to the Radically Christian Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Wes McAdams. Here we have one goal: learn to love like Jesus. Today we're starting a new series on Christians and culture. Throughout this series, we're going to be having conversations about how to adapt to various cultures, show cultural sensitivity, and how do we know when to push back against culture. Today's conversation is with Jovan Payes about urban culture. We talk about all kinds of great stuff: ethnicity, justice, city life, what Christians in that environment, in the urban environment, need to understand, but also what Christians in other environments can learn. We'll get to that conversation in just a moment, but before we do, I want to encourage you to check out VidAngel, a service that helps you filter objectionable content out of your movies and television shows. I use it with Netflix and with Amazon Prime videos all the time. It makes it so that I can actually enjoy these shows with and without my kids. If you're interested in a free trial, go to radicallychristian.com/vidangel, radicallychristian.com/vidangel, or you can use the code radically when you sign up on VidAngel's website. Okay, now my conversation with Jovan Payes. Jovan Payes, welcome to the podcast, brother.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I am so glad to have you. We were talking before we hit the record button that I honestly thought that I had you on the show before. So I'm sorry it's taken so long, but I'm so glad we finally made it happen.
Yeah, me too. So honored to be here. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Fantastic. Well, before we get into that conversation, why don't you tell us a little bit about your life and your ministry, and maybe even how it's going to be changing here before too long?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in the church, and I became a Christian right when I was about 16, and came out of street gangs and things of those kind of things, and then got to church life, went to Fred Hardeman, ended up in ministry. I've been in ministry, local ministry now for about close to 16 years. In full-time ministry. Before that, a lot of preaching here, preaching there, and now I've been in Bakersfield for the last 11 of those 16 years, and soon, in a couple months, I'll be transitioning to higher education, Christian higher education at Faulkner University as the new dean of students there. So some changes, but ministry, and I'm really excited to have this new sort of wrinkle to the ministry. So.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, I love the way that you think about things. You came and did a men's retreat for us here at McDermott Road, I guess maybe a couple of years ago. And I love the way that you talked about culture and our faith and how we navigate those things, and the sort of the balance that you bring to things, and even the way that you use your background and how you grew up and things that you experienced, people that you knew, the life that you lived then. And then allow the Lord to redeem that, and then you bring that knowledge and understanding to us, and help some of us that might not have grown up in the same type of an environment, and it really is incredibly valuable. So when I had this idea that we need to talk about Christianity and culture and how we as followers of Jesus navigate culture, broadly speaking, in whatever culture we find ourselves. You were one of the first people that I wanted to reach out to and ask, okay, what are some of the things that we need to keep in mind, and where should we kick off this conversation? And you specifically mentioned urban ministry. So talk to us about what being a follower of Jesus is like in urban America, because I imagine a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people listening to this podcast are probably living in a rural environment, maybe even in the Bible Belt where lots of churches exist. So what's life like? What's culture like outside of that, especially in urban America? And what's it like being a follower of Jesus in those places?
Well, yeah, that's a really great question and good starting point. And part of that is it's something that I wrestle with a lot, and I think there's a sort of an unexpressed assumption or premise here at times when we talk about urban and rural America, and it's that, and I just recently heard, I think, a sermon online making some of these points that I think are dangerous from the point of view of misconception. And the issue is that we tend to separate urban and rural as along the lines of, or a dichotomy of the rural is more God friendly. We're in God's country. We're those sorts of things, and then the cities, that's where all the bad stuff happens, and that's where sin is sin, and it's just dirty and murky and those sorts of things. And the problem there is, if I read Romans 1 through 3 correctly, it doesn't matter where you are. Sin is sin. If I read the battle in Colossians accurately, there is a kingdom of darkness everywhere. And we all have to be translated into the kingdom of Jesus. So, the problem, one of the big problems I think we need to face and sort of figure out how to better wrestle with is kind of an ethnocentric or cultural-centric problem where we elevate one over the other. I'll give you an example, and I don't want to name out a particular Brotherhood magazine, but I'm an archivist. I like to collect different Brotherhood publications, and especially ones that have been significant for shaping our ideas, especially because I didn't grow up in the church. So what I found very interesting is when you go through these archives and you look at the covers of these sort of magazines, you begin to see a sort of a worldview and sort of a way of looking at the world and culture. And a lot of it is emphasizing the rural, the countryside. And when we have, I don't know if you know Brother Michael Whitworth, he's a photographer. He takes beautiful photographs of nature, the universe, and just so many beautiful things. And yes, you can appreciate that, but don't forget that Christianity was born in the urban society. Christianity was born there. That's the birthing suite of Christianity, is the urban environment. And a lot of what we do, therefore, is framed by the urban kind of street life. The metaphors, everything is very culturally relevant. And so what I want to say is, in an urban environment, the things that you deal with, the sins or even just the cultural expectations, they come to you faster than they might happen in the rural world. It used to be where, before internet, social media, it used to be culture traveled from, let's say, England or France or something, and it came to New York, and then it came to San Francisco, and then it hit maybe Texas, and then it spread out to the rest of the American context. And then music would travel to my family descends from Central America, and music there was always like a year or two late. But now, of course, with social media, everything is fast, and so it's really optics now. Kids in rural America and kids in urban society, they're almost on the same cultural page, more so than it was in the past. And what we're really finding in books that I've been reading on missions and culture, the cities is returning to becoming the dominant place. that that no, it's like cities are growing to such an extent where they're becoming the real influence. It's no longer like the government. It's no longer top down. It's becoming bottom up, and so we need to really pay attention to that. And so, like I said, being in a rural environment, you might wake up and it might be a beautiful day, and you might not meet someone or see someone until you go to town. You might not have to deal with anything until it confronts you, until you realize that the culture that has come through our phones has now hit home. But in a city, most of us are living in apartments, and you can hear the things going on next door. You can hear the things going on above you. You are stomping on someone's living room. It is, you're just tightly wound, and so sin is present, not less. It's just more transparent. And
Yeah.
that's how I see it. That's
Yeah.
big difference. And that
You
might
know,
be.
you
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you reminded me of something I preached about on Sunday. I was talking about Psalm 8 and about the value of human beings. And I challenged people to think about the most beautiful thing that they'd ever seen in their life, the most amazing, awesome, inspiring, breathtaking thing they've ever seen in their life. And I suggested that it might be the Grand Canyon, or it might be Niagara Falls, or it might be some beautiful building. But then I said, but it's probably not any of those things. The most amazing thing that any of us have ever seen is every single human being we've ever encountered. And that's the thing about the city, is that they're full of people. and sure, you're right that there is the negative, and we tend to think about the negative. We tend to think about the sin, and we tend to think about the corruption and the crime, and we think about those kinds of things. Of course, those things are also present in other places, but there's also an amazing beauty. And if we understood that human beings are the image of our God, that might give us a totally different perspective on the city, because we're surrounded by images of our God. We're surrounded by the most breathtaking, the most amazing of all of God's creation. The pinnacle of his creation on earth are these human beings, and yet we take each other for granted. We mistreat each other. We assume the worst. We assume the negative. Does that sort of play into your perspective on city life?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I grew up in San Francisco. Let's put that out there. So I was born and raised in San Francisco, lived there for 24 years before I really got out into ministry, and minus years in college. The city for me was one of my best schools, bar none, in terms of cultural humility. I can go from let's say my starting point, cultural reference being a Hispanic, to my best friend at the time, who was Punjabi Indian. Then from there go to another good friend who's Japanese, and so I had to learn. Some houses you take your shoes off, other places get ready for the aroma of all the spices in their cupboard, or another place where you just had to learn to be culturally sensitive. And in a city like San Francisco, you can run into 5 or 6 different cultures in one single day's journey. Different parts you might find in the city being some hiking trails where you feel like you're not in the city anymore, and it just would vary from day to day, and you had to learn adaptability. And one of the things that sometimes doesn't happen in rural settings is learning how to adapt. Paul, there's a reason why Paul could say, I became all things to all men, because he was in often cosmopolitan environments, preaching the gospel, and he had to do those things that required adaptability, where he didn't say, well, I'm this and I'm always going to be this, and you better just the other has to bow to my preferences and my worldview lens. He learned how to stay who he was as a follower of Christ, and yet adapt how he interacted with others without forgetting his identity. And so there is the temptation. Of course, in a city, you're tempted to become this sort of amalgamation, right, and super fluid. Whereas in a rural environment, you might be really tempted to be one thing and not learn that this is your starting point. And our cultural awareness is our starting point. It is not the end of where we, should be looking at our neighbor who, might be from a different place and might need grace, and we might need more grace as well in understanding other people's, perspective. So, and that has to deal with sin, and it has to deal with the marvel of being a human being. One of the things I love about the city, and I find it interesting, I have a lot of background ambiance music sometimes when I'm just doing maybe reading, or I just need to clear my mind, and I will put on like cityscape sounds, hearing like the streetcar in San Francisco, hearing just the talking of the people. My bedroom window faced the sidewalk, and the conversations just randomly, coming by, or the train coming by, give me such a sense of passivity. Not to mention, the beauty of the landscape of, the cityscape itself, just the buildings, the high-rising. Like every time I drive in through the Bay Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge, I'm overwhelmed with a million memories. And so it's sort of, there's a lot of that going on in the city, and so there's a vibrancy. But moving to, say, for example, when I went from San Francisco to Henderson, Tennessee, which was a huge culture shakeup, I learned to slow down. I learned the beauty of slowing down. I learned the beauty of enjoying the moment. And those are the things that you can't really always enjoy in the city. And so we tend to try to put a value on that, on the distinctions, but we really just need to appreciate that that they provide different moments.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It strikes me that as you talked about cultural sensitivity and cultural humility, that one of the things that, and it could be true in a rural environment, in a suburban environment, in an urban environment, it could be true wherever that we are, that we don't like to be inconvenienced. We don't like to be interrupted, and we don't like sort of things that feel like they're intruding on our typical way of doing life. Like you said, our starting point. And the more sort of mono-ethnic, for instance, community that we're in, we really don't have to be interrupted. We don't have to have our routine, change from moment to moment. But when you live in a cosmopolitan area, when you live in an urban community, you do have people from all different backgrounds. And so there's this necessity of being sensitive, a necessity to be sensitive, a necessity to be humble and to accommodate other people. And like you said, Paul does the exact same sort of thing. And so, it strikes me that often it really, how important it is to see people as worthy of valuable enough to interrupt us, to say, I don't see it as an inconvenience. I want to be interrupted. I want people involved in my life. And we tend to give that sort of leeway to certain people or to certain things, and we welcome certain interruptions, but we don't necessarily welcome interruptions from strangers and from people who are going to disrupt our flow and our routine. But it does strike me how the times I've visited cities, and of course, you're going to have all kinds of people in all kinds of places. But when I've gone to, I live in the Dallas area, so I live in a city now. But when I've visited Manhattan, when I visited LA, when I've visited some of these huge cities, how friendly people are and how they don't necessarily, not always, but they don't necessarily see it as a bother to ask for directions. I've even been standing on a street corner in Manhattan trying to find my way to the next subway, and someone has stopped me to give me directions because they could tell that my wife and I didn't know where we were going. And I thought that doesn't fit the stereotype of the way that people from a rural environment think about people who live in Manhattan or people that live in LA. And so, there's a lot that we can learn from each other regardless of cultural context.
Absolutely. And that can get reversed, right? So, city boy going to the country, or the rural South or something, and small town America. I brought a lot of assumptions because, and honestly, a lot of this has to do with your starting point, and I brought a lot of assumptions. So when people would greet me in the streets in Henderson, because I came pretty close after leaving street life and everything, which is a different experience even within the city, and people would greet me and I would immediately have red flags just because people were greeting me. And it didn't mean that I didn't have really nice experiences. I can give you 100 different stories in my own life where, let's say, I'm sitting at a bus stop and I just comment that, man, that food smells good, that this person just had purchased from the store behind the bus stop, and they whipped out another fork and said, do you want to just eat with me while we're waiting for the bus? And I'm just going, sure. And the sort of friendliness there is, again, what you might not think would happen in the city, but it happens. And the same thing could be said in rural spaces. This place is supposed to be God's place, or this place that's supposed to be more, morally virtuous, or however we might see that or frame that, can also be home to very inhospitable, if I could say that nicely, inhospitable expectations or treatment of the other. And so every place has the dark stain of sin, but every place also has the light of being made in the image of God. Places of community and places of danger, and you just have to sort of learn how to be able to see it, maybe get some cultural glasses on and appreciate what's going on.
Yeah. So let's kind of hone in just a little bit and get a little bit more specific with, as followers of Jesus, as we're trying to navigate life in an urban context, and for those that aren't in that context, and they're sort of looking through the window at what's life like for a follower of Jesus. What are some of the passages maybe that come to your mind? You may have already mentioned some of those. What are some of the things that Scripture teaches people that are particularly helpful for those who are trying to navigate this kind of a world as a follower of Jesus?
Well, right. I mentioned already, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where the Apostle Paul is becoming all things to all people, that he might win some. And in some degree, that is the cultural mission approach, that we have to learn what our neighbors are like. We have to take a moment to step back and appreciate our differences, not simply to treat people as evangelistic targets, but to really understand people and their life experiences. There's this great book, James W. Sire, The Universe Next Door, and it's all about worldviews, and it's really critical in a city to take a moment to step back and go, we're really in a melting pot or diverse experience, and as Christians we need to take what Paul is doing and realize that I need to appreciate what my neighbor is like. How does my neighbor live? Why do they do the things they do? And for us to kind of adapt to them rather than forcing them to adapt to us. And I think that is an important sort of Christian value that we need to underscore, is that too many times, I think really too many times, I see this as a minister, I've seen it as a Christian in the city, we we expect the world around us to conform to us before we can have a talk with them. But if we don't know how to reach them, we will never be able to teach them. And to reach them, we have to understand them. And that's going to take time. And it's going to take us taking ourselves out of the center of the conversation and bring us to more of a help me understand, like ask questions, be someone who walks alongside the person in order to sort of have the conversation, because if we come in, well, you're not a Christian, you just wouldn't understand. You're from the city, you just wouldn't understand the proper etiquette, or you're from the city, or you're from the urban environment, you just won't get it. You're country bumpkin, you just never understand real life. You have to really just take the moment. So, and a lot of that has to do with, again, understanding that as Christians, Paul talks about that we have a duty, we have an obligation, we have a debt to everyone, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Romans 1:16-17, because in the Gospels the power of God that is revealed, that it goes to everyone, right? And it really boils down to our faith. The other thing I would say is this. I've even heard this in sermons, and I was wondering if I was going to bring it up in a recent talk I had on racism, but sometimes we think that preaching the gospel means you lose your culture. I've heard it said, your only culture now is Christian, so you're no longer, black, or you're no longer Hispanic, or you're no longer this or that and the other. You are a Christian. That's your cultural identity. And the problem with that is it's absolutely impractical. And it is an absolute denial of the marvelous tapestry of human experience that is part of human beings creating culture. Culture itself is not wrong. Cultural identity is not wrong. The problem really emerges when it becomes our only identity. And so we tend to try to wash off what should not be washed off of our human identity. Not everything in every culture is good. Not every assumption at the bottom of some of our habits or behaviors is good, but it doesn't mean I stop being Hispanic because I'm a Christian now. That's a real convenient thing to say, but it's really impractical. And Christians need to be more culturally sensitive. The other thing there is, as Christians, we see Jesus preaching a lot about love and justice. And justice, biblically defined, is really what we need to be pursuing. Sometimes justice gets redefined and taken from us with a lot of these new social justice movement issues, which we should address, but from a biblical orientation. And sometimes the debate is, well, there's too much justice talk. Let's just go to the gospel. Well, if you read Amos, let justice flow, like rivers of water. In Amos, he's not just talking about, I think Amos 5:24, I think, he's not just talking about some sort of artificial justice. He's calling the people of Israel who had lost themselves in the city to become people who return to God's plan for their lives, for how to treat the vulnerable, how to care for the vulnerable, how to protect the vulnerable. And from that, let justice flow like one of these sort of flash floods, and let it go from a flash flood river to a sustained river. And that's what we're called to be. And so justice is essential to the gospel. And as Christians in the city, we can see injustice, systemic issues, We can see what happens when evil really takes over human enterprise, and when even our governmental system betray us, and we can see that in a far quicker, I think, in my opinion, quicker way. We see the tip of the spear faster than perhaps other cultural environments. I'm not saying the rural city can't, or rural America can't do that. It's just when you are breathing it in and day out,
Yeah.
it's not just an academic situation. You're living it.
Yeah. I mean, anytime you get that many people in close proximity to one another and they're all experiencing whatever is coming down, the pike, whatever's coming down, they're experiencing it first before it gets to the rest of the country, to the rest of the world later on, that sort of trickles down. They're experiencing it very first. So like you said, they're going to experience it early on. Let's talk about this idea of justice. I wasn't expecting to get into this, but do you think that there's a difference? Do you think that most, especially Christians maybe, think about retribution when they think about justice, and they don't think about restorative justice, and they don't think about sort of making things as it's supposed to be? And I think sometimes when people hear the word justice, they think, well, who are you trying to punish? Like, who are you trying to get even with? And certainly there is an element of retribution in God's justice, but a lot of what we're called to, I think about passages like Romans 12, and how we are supposed to be living as peacemakers in the world. And part of that making peace is being a part of, I think, God setting things right through us and in us, working in His Holy Spirit within His people to sort of set things right as far as we're able to. There's an already not yet sense to that. We're waiting for the age to come, but living in this world, we're supposed to be doing good and making things right and putting things as it's supposed to be. Do you think that's an element that we sort of don't pay attention to, or we sort of ignore when it comes to the conversation of justice?
Absolutely. I really am thankful that you bring this up. So a couple years ago, I did a public engagement talk, and I was asked to answer 3 questions. One had to do with like CRT stuff, but the other 2 questions had to do with what is biblical justice and what is forgiveness. And these are questions generated from a major United States university campus students, like major. And I was really taken aback that people were asking questions on what is forgiveness. And a lot of that has to do with we have created sort of a conversation where justice is only retribution. That's the only way you get justice. As Christians, we have a unique situation going on. We have a God who is holy other as well. We have a God who is forgiving and merciful, but who is righteous, who calls us to account for our sins and tells us that we're going to be held accountable for all that we've done in the body, in public, and in private. We can list a whole host of passages there, like, at the end of Ecclesiastes. But then we're saved by grace. We're saved not through true, pure justice. If I could be a bit dangerous here, I don't know that we're saved by justice. Grace is not justice. Grace is the treatment of someone who's done something wrong and not giving them what they deserve. So, as Christians, we end up with a salvation by grace through the punishment of someone else who is not us. And we are given the righteousness, as Paul says in Philippians, that is not our own. And yet, we're also supposed to speak the 2 things that God has spoken to us: His justice, His holiness, that the world is condemned in sin, but offers us grace. And when I really came to grips with this, it came to me when I was reading the Gospels for the first time, and in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." And as a street kid in gangs, I go, yeah, hate your enemy. Oh, love your neighbor. Yeah, for sure. But you don't ever love your enemy. And yet, that's exactly what God has done. When we read through Scripture, we always hear that love of the world is enmity with God, and hatred and animosity against God, right? So God is asking us to do what He has done in loving our neighbor, and has to do with loving your enemies, praying for your enemies, going the extra mile for those that would mistreat you. And so you have a lot of this counterintuitive justice, because we tend to think of it in a retributive kind of way. We think of it in a you owe me, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And what's again in the Sermon on the Mount regarding retaliation, this passage is a legit concept. Exodus 21, 24, Leviticus 24, 30. These sorts of passages about this retributive justice that they grew up on, which is scriptural. Like, they can go to a passage and say, look, I have the right to take your tooth, whatever it might be. And Jesus here is actually going deeper. What is the deeper issue in these commands from the law? It's not just don't break these laws or you have these other rights for justice. It's that you need to look deeper. Retribution is not the only way to handle wrongs. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that we have to face when it comes to justice as Christians, or people who seek God's plan for human reconciliation, is that we're never going to be able to fix all the wrongs through retributive, compensatory justice. And we have to use those spaces to say, as Jesus said, isn't it just best to sometimes just be wronged and forgive and move forward? Which, this is a great lesson, because this is how God treats us as His. He doesn't just forgive us, He does more than that. And this is a big piece of the forgiveness, the social dynamic of forgiveness when we follow God's plan, is if we follow His plan, He tells us our wrongs, He calls us into grace, He then frees us from our sin. We're no longer criminals, so to speak. We're no longer guilty in front of Him. Then He adds us to His family. The enemy becomes His family. And for some people that will be impossible, depending on the kinds of pain and hurt, right? But it doesn't mean that the path isn't there for some sort of letting go. That's what forgiveness means after all. It's this idea of letting it go. And we have a great example. And in the city or the rural world, we really have to come to grips with that, because in the city, when we're really confronted with injustice, it's easy to say, I want payback. It's easy to say, and I can really solve this with road rage, or I can really solve this with you touch me, I touch you. And all of us have the temptation to handle it ourselves and feel vindicated and justified. But Paul tells the Christians in Rome, in Romans chapter 12 at the very end, as much as is possible, be at peace or live at peace with all men, right? Give space for judgment, for God will avenge. He has declared it. The Lord has said it. He will avenge for us. And then he gives us, of course, Paul immediately moves into the government's role. And it's a curious thing for me when you think about Rome itself. It had not the best track record of justice, but the point is, there are tools in the world that God has in which He will judge for us. He will bring judgment for us, whether it's through His direct, immediate providence, or He's going to use the long game of civic judgment and justice. And we have to learn to give that to Him. And that's a really hard thing. So with racism, the church can't be silent, but we also have to find gospel ways to bring it up. And Ephesians chapter 2 shows us that in Christ, He brings all humanity together, and we become one human experience. In the church, in Jesus, we become one single shared human experience in which He brings peace. I mean, the prophecy of the church, or the kingdom of God, or however we might frame it, Isaiah chapter 2, all nations will flow to the house of God, and we will all walk in His ways, and we will all learn of His truths. And that requires us to do what Isaiah says, turn our swords and all of our weaponry into farming tools, and become a community that is sustainable.
As you were talking, Jovan, I mean, so many things came to my mind. I'm so glad we got into Romans a little bit, because really this is a letter written to exactly the kind of group of Christians we're talking about. We're talking about a multi-ethnic group of Jesus followers, maybe that had segregated themselves because of time and sort of political circumstances, had segregated themselves into sort of Jewish house churches and Gentile house churches. So there was ethnic conflict between them. There was conflict in all kinds of different ways, sort of a ethnocentrism. You used that term earlier. That was going on, and then sort of how to navigate that, and how to bring peace, and how to love one another, not only within that community, within the Christian community, but also, like you said, loving enemies and bringing peace. And this was a random thought that came to my mind while you were talking. There was a movie back in the 90s. I don't know if you ever saw it. I don't think it was any good. There was probably all kinds of things in there, all kinds of disclaimers I will put with it. But I think it was called Crash.
Yeah.
And it was about sort of the racism and stereotyping that went on in sort of these kinds of environments. And as you were talking, I thought, what would it look like for Spirit-filled followers of Jesus to be in these environments from all different ethnic groups, speaking all kinds of native languages, having all different cultures, and bringing healing and peace and love and joy and the fruit of the Spirit into these communities, because that's what the justice we're talking about looks like. We're not talking about the kind of justice that sort of people on either end of the political spectrum are talking about. That's not the sort of justice we're talking about. We're talking about the justice of God that is brought about right now by the Spirit of God living within His people, a people who, like you said, have taken their swords and beat them into plowshares, a people who love their enemies, a people who leave it to the vengeance of God, who do not seek vengeance on their own, and are waiting for the judgment of God, and in the meantime are bringing about the justice of God by striving to make peace and make things right. And imagine the healing that could be brought about in any community, but especially where there are multiple ethnic groups and people with all different backgrounds living in close proximity, because sometimes the sins that we're talking about forgiving are not personal sins. They're things that, my grandfather, this happened to my grandfather, these people, this group of people did this to my dad, or this group of people did this to my people. And so sometimes there is animosity and anger that is group anger, animosity. And that's the sort of forgiveness and healing and love and justice that has to happen, and can only happen through Jesus and through the Spirit.
Well said. I like to tell my congregation that in the church, we are fully equipped to do what the world cannot.
Yes.
And that's create a new chance for peace in the human family.
Yeah.
And it's essential to know that as Christians, really, we're supposed to let our egos die. The whole idea, right? Romans 6, 1 through 10, Colossians chapter 2, verse 10 all the way to Colossians 3, verse 12 or something like that. When you go through the vices, the old man is supposed to die. The old person, the old us, the old impulses. Colossians is very literal. Put to death. Execute the vices in you. And one of the things I love about the church is God has, in His wisdom, brought a way for strangers to come together to become a family. And that takes work, and it takes sensitivity, it takes listening. The church I was in San Francisco was a multicultural congregation. We had a Spanish work, we had a Chinese work, we had the English speaking, and I learned a lot of valuable lessons early on there in that how we interact with each other, even little micro gestures like what language speaks first in a worship assembly. Is it always going to be English translated into the others? Or is it going to be Spanish or Chinese and then translated into English? What sort of movements do we make can make a huge difference in how we express unity, equality, sort of the equity of the kingdom. We're all the same in Christ. And the thing is, we tend not to be sensitive to those interactions. We tend to lead, with the dominant culture and become insensitive to I don't want to say minorities per se, but it's hard to say it in any other way. Minority cultures, in the sense of, well, we're the dominant, so you have to there's a chain of command, there's a hierarchy, and that becomes problematic. Before God there is no hierarchy. If there was, man, we should all be speaking Hebrew and Aramaic, but there's not. And I think a lot about that right now. The passage is eluding me, but the statement is, all the day long we're being sacrificed for you. And that is at the heart of our human experience with others, for Jesus, for God. Him being the Lamb of God shows us how to be His flock, right? We learn how to be God's sheep, and that means we sacrifice ourselves for others, for each other, and all this wrapping up back into the city conversation, the urban Christian. We have these constant opportunities for humility, constant learning opportunities that you don't know what you think you know, or you don't know enough, which just stay humble. Be like Bruce Lee used to say, be like water. You pour the water into a glass, it becomes the shape of the glass. You pour it into a vase, it becomes the shape of the vase. Be like water. And that's an apocryphal source, right? But I appreciate that, because that's Paul's statement. I became all things to all people. And as urban Christians, that's really important, because we all have different starting points, but all of us, if we lead to Christ, so it doesn't matter if your family came from the country, that you were farmers, and you came to the city for whatever reason. You went to college and you had to be a transplant and you moved to the city. It doesn't matter if you were born in the city. It doesn't matter if you were born in the slums of the city. I've been in every kind of environment. I've been into rich homes in the city where teenagers are painting their rooms black and they're on heroin. And I've been in poor homes with dirty walls, and the kids are 4.3 GPA students, and they're working hard, and they're not taking any opportunity lightly, and the extremes of all human experiences is what makes being an urban Christian, I think, different. And because of that, you really have to tap into the human dignity of the person in front of you, and how the gospel translates to each individual experience. It's all this. It's the same gospel, but all of us are facing life very differently and nuanced, and it's not a monolith. We I think that's the great challenge of the city, and the great opportunity in front of us is we have a great source to learn from. I think of 1 Peter 4 as a Christian. I remember a new Christian in San Francisco. I felt so alone. This really hit me when he's writing to these Christians, and he says in chapter 4, he said, for the time that is past, verse 3, that suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you, but they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. And this is why the gospel was preached, so forth and so on. And the thing is, you're going to stand out. So here I was looking like them, baggy pants, hoodies, hats to the side and everything, but I'm a Christian. And they think I have the same assumptions, and when I don't, great conversations happen.
There's another passage that I was trying to think of, and I thought I had it and I didn't. But Paul says to give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. That idea of giving thought to what is honorable in the sight of all, like living at peace, doing what, so far as it depends on us, living at peace, but also giving thought to do what other people will not see as dishonorable. That sort of understanding the world through somebody else's eyes, or striving to, a lot of what we've talked about today makes me realize that if we really considered ourselves missionaries in a community, then we would give thought to what's the culture there like. When I went to Estonia with my family a couple of years ago, we were only going to be there a week, and yet we were talking about what's the culture there like. What do people there value? What do they think about? How do they think that's a little bit different than the way we think? But we don't tend to do that in our own community, in the community we grew up in. We assume that we know it. We assume that we understand the culture when sometimes we don't. And especially when there is a multi-ethnic culture, when there's different cultures all living in one community. And if we really were about the mission of God to bring peace and healing and hope and the gospel, the good news about the reign of Jesus to our communities, then we'd want to know what's the culture like here, and how can I present the gospel in a way and live in a way that is honorable in the sight of all people. So Jovan, I'm curious, as we sort of wrap up some of this, what are some of the things about what you see within churches, congregations that exist in these sort of urban communities? What are some of the things that they're doing that excite you? What are the possibilities that excite you? And especially, what can Christians in other places learn from churches that are thriving and doing well in these sorts of urban communities?
Yeah, there's some, I think there are a lot of good things, and 2 to 3 things really pop into my mind about this. One, some churches have been really good at decentralizing their dominant ethnic culture. What I mean by that is, and I say all these kind of ethnic terms with respect, so you might have a church that has a dominant white culture, and it slowly becomes multi-ethnic. It purposefully begins to make decisions, whether it's we're gonna really blend with our community. Our community has changed around us, and we also need to adjust to that. I've seen churches do that, and that's really exciting because the church should not be a place where we reinforce cultural stereotypes. We should be diverse. as much as possible. If all nations are going to flow into the house of God, we need to embrace that very, very purposefully. And I've seen churches do that in urban environments. And yet, even within those congregations, they are championing specific ministries to these different ethnic groups in their community. So maybe there's a congregation with the Hmong community. Maybe there's a Spanish or Chinese work. Maybe there's a strong developing Latino community within a congregation, and so they outreach, and so I've seen that's really promising. Additionally, the conversations are being created by congregations that have been historically segregated, individualized, separate and apart, and they're trying to have conversations with each other. They're trying to bridge these gaps by trying to find new ways to work together that perhaps they haven't done in years or ever. And so I'm seeing that as well, that sometimes pulpit swapping. I've been a part of pulpit swapping where, I've preached at, an all-black congregation, and we've had their preacher preach at our place, and the culture expectations are very different, but we've enjoyed the opportunity for this fellowship, and it's all about exposure. It's all about building relationships, and you can't have a relationship with someone unless you actually relate to each other and have these moments and opportunities. So I've seen that as well. The other thing I would say is in multi-language or bilingual or trilingual congregations, having more integrated worship experiences is also something that I see in some places that are really thriving, and by doing that and not having sort of a hierarchy of language is a really purposeful thing. And it's one of the hardest things to do, because we have a tendency to think, well, we might see ourselves as the sort of sponsor of, and sometimes our language betrays us. We're the sponsoring congregation. Well, what does that even mean in terms of value? It really doesn't mean anything. But we have leveraged that language by accident, I think, into a hierarchy of ethnicities at times within congregations. And seeing that being dissolved and more organic, trust between, different language based brethren, that's important. Sometimes the struggle, though, is we don't want to lose our cultural identity. So we'll do that, but we're fine over here. And I struggle with that. I think we need to be careful. We should respect people who love their cultural heritage, but Christ didn't come to save our culture. He came to save our souls. Our culture gets redeemed because we've now been part of the kingdom, and the kingdom gives us perhaps new visions for our cultural expression, and that is going to be found in the church. And so, but yeah, those three things I see a lot. I think we see that working in the cities better. I see it a lot across the country when I travel, but those are the things that I think work the most.
Well, thank you for this conversation. Let me ask you one last question as we sort of wrap up. If you had one thing to sort of summarize that you wish that all Christians understood about this topic, what would it be?
In terms of being an urban Christian, I would say that remember that the city is where the gospel was preached, and it's where the predominant letters to churches were written to. I love Wayne Meeks' book, The Urban Christian, and about Paul's mission work. And we need to realize that the city is a mission field. It's not the place we run from. it's a place we need to run to.
Jovan, thank you for this conversation, and thank you for your work in the kingdom, brother. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate you too. Thank you. I enjoyed being on here, and looking forward to other things that you got going on.
Likewise, brother. Thanks. Thank you so much for listening to the Radically Christian Bible Study Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I want to encourage you to make sure you're subscribed and also take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening. It really does help more people find this content. I also want to thank my guests who join me each week and my McDermott Road Church family who helps make this podcast possible. You can find out more about Radically Christian at radicallychristian.com. I love you. God loves you. Now let's all go out and love like Jesus.